So this is chapter 5, Mishnah 20, depending on which book you're using. So it starts Yehuda ben Tema. That's the one. It starts Yehuda ben Tema. What's the other number? 23. Okay. So that's what we're learning over here is Yehuda ben Tema Omer. I think it's fair to say that this is one of the better known Mishnahs. I know it's a little unfair to say that sometimes, to judge or to rate Mishnahs and their popularity. But this is definitely one of the better known Mishnahs. I'm going to run through the whole Mishnah first, then come back and we'll break it essentially into 3 parts. But running through the Mishnah, please pay attention to the one thing that must jump out at you about this Mishnah, that makes it fundamentally different to any other Mishnah we have learned. And we've learned quite a few. I mean, we're already in chapter 5, towards the end of chapter 5, so we've learned a few. Yehuda ben Tema Omer, Yehuda ben Tema says, Have oz kanomer, that you should be bold as a leopard, V'kal kanesher, and light as an eagle, Rotz katzvi, run like a deer, V'gibor ko'ari, and be as strong as a lion, La'asos retzoin avicha shebashamayim, to do the will of your Father in heaven. That's part 1. Part 2, Hu ha'yo'omer, he used to say, Az ponim legehenim, a person who is insolent goes to Gehenna, or boishes ponim le Gan Eden, and a person who is shamefaced, there's a person who is more modest, will go to Gan Eden. That's part 2. Part 3, Yehi ratzon b'fanecha Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu, may it be your will, Hashem our God, God of our fathers, she'ibone Beis Hamikdash b'mheir v'yameinu, that the Beis Hamikdash should be rebuilt speedily in our days, v'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha, and grant us our portion in your Torah. What's the thing that jumps out at you about this Mishnah?
That there's very common things that we hear all the time.
It's a common Mishnah. That's not what jumps out. Yeah, what about it? That it's got what? In other words, there's a prayer. There's a prayer in the Mishnah. We haven't seen that, and we're not going to see that again. Why is there a prayer in the Mishnah? Yehi ratzon, may it be your will, Hashem. That doesn't fit. Mishnah is teaching. It's Torah. Tefillah is something else. Tefillah is a totally different method of connection to Hashem. Just to put it into the most generic terms possible, Tefillah is us approaching Hashem. Torah is Hashem approaching us. Right? Because what is Torah? Torah is Matan Torah. We say every single morning in our prayers. Hashem gave us the Torah. Torah is Hashem approaching us. Prayer is us approaching Hashem. They're 2 totally different technologies of connection with Hashem. And so there's it's totally out of place to have a prayer inside a Mishnah. Why is there a prayer inside this Mishnah? That should be the one question that jumps out at us. The other question we have to ask is, what's the link between the 3 parts of this Mishnah? The first part sounds like good advice. 4 types of personalities or 4 types of traits that a person should look to inculcate. Then the distinction between people who are, so to speak, chutzpahdik, bold or insolent, versus people who are more modest. And then a prayer. So what's the link between the 3? The other question we have to ask ourselves is, what's the connection to the previous Mishnah? Because usually there is some kind of a flow from one Mishnah to the next. What's the connection to the previous Mishnah? Okay, so there's no number, fine. But there were other Mishnahs we've looked at also that didn't have numbers in this particular chapter. So what's the link to the previous Mishnah? Okay, let's start there. Why don't we start there? What could you see as a link between this Mishnah and the previous Mishnah? Anything at all? Anything that jumps out at you? The previous Mishnah was the difference between a student of Avraham, which is quite relevant this week. We're starting Parshas Lech Lecha. We're learning about Avraham's life, and a student of Bilam. So that was last week's Mishnah. The difference between being a student of Avraham and a student of Bilam. So what's the link from that to this Mishnah?
So it's 2 sets of traits.
2 sets of traits, yeah, that's true. It has 2 sets of traits. And how did we end off the last Mishnah? We ended off by saying that a student of Bilam goes to Gehenna. That's how we ended off. And we brought a pasuk to prove it. But the point was that Yorsh Gehenna, that they go to Gehenna. So we were talking about Gehenna in the previous Mishnah. So therefore in this Mishnah, we want to talk about Gehenna again And obviously, the distinction that Avraham Avinu's students get this world and the next world. So we're going to talk about Gan Eden as well. So that's the link between the previous Mishnah and this Mishnah. There we spoke about the difference between people who have access to Gan Eden and those who go to Gehenna. And so are we doing in this Mishnah too. That's the link, right? Is that a good link?
It seems like it.
Seems like a good link. So what's the question then, if that's the link? If that is the link, then this Mishnah should have started by saying, "Az panim leGehenna, uboishes panim leGan Eden." Should have started with part 2, which is the part that talks about 2 different types of people: the one who goes to Gehenna and the one who goes to Gan Eden, because that would match with the previous Mishnah, where we spoke about those who go to Gehenna and those who go to Gan Eden. But that's not how this Mishnah started. This Mishnah went off onto a different topic about what you learn from various kinds of animals, and then we came back to the story of the Gehenna and the Gan Eden. Why does it not flow in a logical manner?
If you look at this book, it's got them in
two separate Mishnahs. Okay, that's even more confusing, right? Right, exactly. A whole Mishnah in between. That's even more confusing. So why not? Why not? It's interesting that they made that division, because all the Meforshim point out that it's a link to the previous Perek. So that's interesting. Anyway, so why do this? Why do it out of context? And so the answer is a really interesting answer, because we know how people learn. We know that yes, there is a flow sometimes often from one Mishnah to the next, but not everybody learns the Mishnahs in order. Very often what people do is they pick out a particular Mishnah just at random, or they're looking for a particular topic and therefore they land up at a particular Mishnah, and people don't always learn things in the context of what came before it. So therefore the Mishnah needed to contextualize for us, because we're going to be talking about the fact that in order to get to Gan Eden, a person needs to have boishes panim, which in the more broadest terms basically means to be shamefaced, and we'll talk about that, versus az panim, which is to have a chutzpahdik face. Before we could get there, the Mishnah wanted to talk about this topic of azus, of chutzpah, which actually emerges as one of the key parts of what this Mishnah is about. Let's first contextualize it, and then we'll get to the segment that links back to the previous Mishnah. So let's talk about chutzpah, shall we? Because it's a big part of this Mishnah, so we may as well discuss it. Because this Mishnah started off by telling us, Yehuda ben Tema says, Have az kanomer, that you should be bold, and the word az also means to be chutzpah, because that's what bold is, that you have a bit of chutzpah. Kanomer, like a leopard. I don't know exactly what it is about leopards that are considered to be the most bold. I think when you go to the Kruger, you think they're the most shy of all of the animals, right? Everybody's so excited to see a leopard because they stay away from the public eye. In fact, when you have a lot of people gathering at a leopard sighting, typically the leopard disappears. They don't seem to like the limelight. So where's the boldness of the leopard? And possibly the answer to that might be because a leopard is the only one of the predators that unprovoked will attack a human. And that's a chutzpah, that's bold. Because as we just saw in the parasha this week, Hashem designed the world in such a way that animals by nature should be afraid of humans. So this is an azus, this is a certain courage or a certain chutzpah that the leopard will have that other creatures don't necessarily have.
And it's also something about the number. How come it's always leopard and not tiger? I mean, how did it come like that?
Okay, so it's a good question. It's basically got to do with the pattern, the actual pattern of a leopard. In fact, I can't remember who it was. I didn't read it in great detail, but one of the Meforshim goes into a whole conversation about the pattern of a leopard as part of the explanation as to why we're talking specifically about the leopard in this context. I think it was the Maharal. It was quite involved, and I figured it was going to be beyond what we needed to learn today, so I didn't actually look into it further. But it has to do with the Namer has to do with blotches rather than stripes, and therefore is associated with the leopard. In any event, so let's come back. Let's talk about chutzpah. Everybody wants to talk about chutzpah, right? What is the actual word? Namer, I think, means to be blotched. Yeah. So the pasuk says, what's the pasuk? Namer chabar burois. Right, so it means like these blotches or spots. I don't want to use the word spots because it doesn't really have spots in the classical sense. Okay, so in any event, so we've got to talk about this concept of az. You've got to be az, right? You've got to be So is it a good thing to have chutzpah or is it not a good thing to have chutzpah? Depends who you ask, right? You know the story of there's this Eged bus driver and he's approaching a particular intersection and this Israeli woman comes up to the front of the bus and she says, excuse me, I need to get off at this intersection. So he says to her, well, the bus stop is another block away, so I'll stop at the bus stop, that's where I stop, and you'll get off there. So she says to him, you know, if you knew what I had, you would let me off at this intersection. So the guy feels really bad and he stops the bus and he opens the doors and she's getting off the bus, and as she's getting off the bus, he says to her, by the way, Geveret, what do you have that's so serious that you had to get off at this intersection? She says, chutzpah. So that's, you know, it's part of the DNA of being Jewish, is to have a little bit of chutzpah. Question is chutzpah positive or is chutzpah negative?
It can be both.
Right? So we're going to see in this Mishnah that there's a difference between being oz or having azus ponim. They're not the same. They look very similar, and both of them might be translated as chutzpah, but they're actually not identical. For example, the Gemara tells us, Yisrael azin sheba'umois. That's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, we are the most chutzpahdik of all the nations. Which, by the way, has been a good thing for us. It's allowed us to firstly to survive, and secondly to succeed. The chutzpah. You read in this week's parasha, and in next week's parasha, you read about Avraham Avinu. He had a tremendous amount of chutzpah. The entire world believed in one type of system, and Avraham Avinu had the chutzpah to get up and to say, you're all wrong. You're all wrong. That's why he was called Ivri. Yes? Why was he called Ivri? You ask people, what does the word Ivri mean? And everybody tells you it means Hebrew, which is not a translation. That's just the anglicized version of the word Ivri. That's as useful as saying that Mashiach means Messiah. Doesn't mean Messiah. Messiah is the anglicized version of the word. Ivri means, from the word Aver, to be on the other side. Because the whole world stood on one end of the moral and theological spectrum, and Avraham Avinu stood on the opposite end. Does that feel a little bit familiar at the moment? Right? To be able to stand on the side of morality and clarity and good values and truth up against this tsunami of people who believe otherwise. That kind of azus, that kind of chutzpah, that is incredibly positive. And that's why you'll notice that what does Yehuda ben Taimah tell us? And by the way, there's an opinion, just for interest's sake, there's an opinion that Yehuda ben Taimah is the same personality as Yehuda ben Dama. Rabbi Yehuda ben Dama, who was killed by the Romans, is one of the martyrs who was killed by the Romans. He was related to Rabbi Yishmael, I think it was his nephew. So there's that one opinion that that's who this man was, because you don't find Yehuda ben Taimah really quoted anywhere else besides this Mishnah. So in any event, so what does he say? He says you have to be as kanomer, you've got to be bold as a leopard, ... because he gives the three other examples. When it comes to doing what Hashem wants, that's where you have to have chutzpah. Chutzpah is not a trait to celebrate in isolation. It's a trait that is appropriate when you're standing up for what Hashem wants. So if it's about doing what Hashem wants, then we have to have azus. Then we have to have that strength and that boldness and courage, even to the extent of chutzpah, to do what Hashem wants. But azus panim, where a person, that's in the second part of the Mishnah, where a person is, you can see it on their face, that's why it calls it azus panim. You could see on the person's face that they are an insolent person. That is the Gehenna. That's going to take a person to the worst kinds of places. And one of the big questions we have to ask about this Mishnah, which we'll address a little bit later, is how do you get this balance right? How do you get the balance of being chutzpahdik when appropriate and not chutzpahdik as a trait? It's not so simple. Not simple at all. So we'll talk about it, we'll come back to it. So what does it mean as kanomer? You know, it's interesting. If you take a look in the Tur, on which the Shulchan Aruch is eventually built, these are the two key works of modern legal Judaism. Why do I say modern? Because you have the Rambam who precedes that, but the Rambam also speaks about areas of Jewish law that are not current, whereas the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch only deal with things that are relevant in current modern Jewish life. So the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch quote this Mishnah right at the beginning. So one of the first teachings that they give us is that you should be bold as a leopard and light as an eagle, strong as a lion, fast as a deer, to do what Hashem wants. Now, there's no accident that they chose those things to be right at the beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, because these are cardinal principles. This is what it is to be Jewish. Yes, there are things that we do as Jewish people. There are things that we have to observe. There are many mitzvahs, and there are things that we have to avoid. But as an overarching set of principles, who should we be? That's what he's talking about over here. Who should we be? We should be people who are bold. The question is, what does bold mean? That's what we've got to analyze. As kanomer, what does it mean to be bold as a leopard? So we'll first look at some of the lesser known interpretations, and then we'll get to the interpretation that is the most commonly accepted, the one that is brought clearly in the Shulchan Aruch. So before we get to the Shulchan Aruch, let's just look at a few others. Okay, so we'll start with one that people are not going to love, and then we'll move to the others. The one that people won't necessarily love is that sometimes you have to be bold enough to tell somebody when they've done something wrong. It's not so simple, right? We much prefer to be liked by other people. And we know that there's a whole series of halachas about how you can rebuke somebody else when they're doing something wrong, right? There are rules about this. You don't just go ahead and rebuke somebody. You have to know, firstly, that they are going to listen to what you have to say. The Torah says, Hoicheach toichiach es amisecha. It's an unusual word, that you should rebuke your peer. But amisecha, the Gemara says, is im she'itcha b'Torah. Somebody who's at your level of observance. That's who you can rebuke. So it's not so simple to go out there and to rebuke somebody. And so therefore, one of the interpretations of being as kanomer, having that boldness, having that chutzpah, is to have the strength and the courage, where relevant, to tell people that what they're doing is inappropriate. Now, welcome to the 21st century. In the 21st century, you are not allowed to tell anybody anything, because whatever people are doing is justified by some kind of a group and some kind of a psychological explanation. And so we are never permitted to ever rebuke somebody else for anything, even if it's absolutely immoral. That's the world that we live in. So how much boldness, how much courage, how much chutzpah do we need in our world to actually point people out and call people out for doing things that are inappropriate? You need a tremendous amount of moral fortitude to be able to do that. In fact, welcome to the 21st century, where forget about trying to rebuke somebody else who might be outside of your immediate circle. We live in a world where you're not even allowed to tell your own children anymore what to do, right? Because who are you? And we live in a different generation and you don't understand us. So to have that confidence and that clarity and that boldness to be able to say, but there are certain things that are absolute truths and absolute morals and values, you have to be bold as a leopard. As kanomer, to be bold as a leopard. Now, very often, aside from the fact that we have to have the boldness to be able to tell other people where they are out of line, and by the way, that's a very big part of living Jewish in the modern world. It's to have the courage to be able to say, you are entitled to your view, and that does not mean that I'm not entitled to share our view. It's a really important thing, whether that be around morality, whether that be around our eternal rights to our heritage, to our land. We have to be able to get up and we have to be able to say it. I wanted to share with you one interesting thing that I came across recently, and that is in 1970, Ariel Sharon, at that time, I believe, was the Minister of Defense, and he had a personal audience with the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And they had a long conversation, and in that conversation, one of the things that the Rebbe said to him is that Israel made a very serious error after the Six-Day War when they referred to the land that they captured during the Six-Day War as occupied territory. And they would pay the price for using that language in the future. And he suggested to Ariel Sharon that he should go back and tell the government that they should rather use the more accurate term, liberated territories. Because this is our ancestral land, and so therefore they are liberated territories. Now you've got to have, in today's world, you actually have to have a tremendous amount of courage to be able to say that. To be able to say, as somebody very succinctly put it yesterday, we have a place called Har HaZeisim. You may have heard of it. Yeah. Yes? Har HaZeisim is a cemetery that is how old? How old is the cemetery in Har HaZeisim? Okay, so how old is the cemetery in Har HaZeisim? Dates back like 2,000 years. How old is the cemetery in Tzfas? where you have the Ovadiah's grave and you have Hannah and her 7 sons. How old is the Maras HaMachpelah in Hebron? We're talking about we have ancestral heritage. The oldest Muslim cemetery in Israel dates back to the 11th century. So sometimes you have to have the courage to be able to say, these are facts. This is not political. This is not a matter of opinion. These are facts. So as kanomer, to be able to tell other people, you've got this wrong. You've actually got this wrong. And you don't necessarily understand how history works or how morality works. At the same time, though, a person might very often think, well, who, me? There are other people, there are professionals out there. You know, we have professionals who represent us. Or we might think that when Hashem, forget about tackling the world, how's about just tackling our own problems? Sometimes it's easier to talk about tackling the world than it is to confront our own problems, our own temptations, our own distractions, our own weaknesses, our own foibles. So sometimes we think, I don't have the wherewithal to be able to actually stand up to my own Yetzer Hara. Therefore it says, have a az kanomer. You have to have the courage to be able to confront whatever area of life it is that you struggle with. Because every one of us is an expert at knowing how the other person could so easily fix that particular area of their life, while simultaneously justifying why we cannot fix this particular area of our lives. So, as kanomer means that we should have the boldness to be able to confront the areas of our life that we find so difficult to overcome. We should have the chutzpah to say, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do this. And you'll see this is again echoed when we speak about the strength of a lion, which we'll get to shortly. But let's talk about the Shulchan Aruch for a second. You know what's interesting about the Shulchan Aruch and what makes it different to a Mishnah? Is that the Shulchan Aruch is how things actually apply in practical Jewish law. The Mishnah might still have some debate around it, and the Gemara might still have some debate. But by the time it arrives in the Shulchan Aruch, this is the bottom line. This is how Jews are meant to live. This is our guidebook. So at the beginning of the Shulchan Aruch, when it quotes this, Hevei az kanomer, that you should be as bold as a leopard, it says clearly that means al yevoish mipnei hamal'igim, that we should never be self-conscious because of people who are our detractors, because of people who scoff at what we do or at what we believe. That is the challenge of az kanomer. So, for example, it's a very sad state of affairs at the moment you do have people who are questioning whether they should be visibly Jewish, because there's so much anti-Jewish feeling in the world right now. And so the Mishnah is telling us, and it's brought as a halacha, al yevoish, we should not be ashamed. We don't have something to be ashamed of. It's not like we've done something wrong by being Jewish. We have nothing to be ashamed of. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much, particularly in the social media space where people are so quick behind the veil of anonymity to attack and to scoff and to belittle, we shouldn't allow that to get inside our heads and to make us feel any less worthy or any less proud of who we are as Jewish people. That is az kanomer. What does it mean, kal kanesher, to be light as an eagle? It's an interesting expression, right? Light as an eagle. What does it mean, light as an eagle? So one explanation is that the Bartanura says, kal kanesher means don't allow ourselves to become complacent. Don't allow ourselves to become apathetic. That's what it means to be light as an eagle. So yes, we've done the same Jewish things for who knows how long now, right? Get up in the morning, we do our davening, we say tehillim, we do mitzvahs, whatever the case is. It could become a little bit blasé. So the idea of kal kanesher is that it's always got this enthusiasm, like the eagle that's always moving, always flying. You should always have some kind of, excitement and enthusiasm about the mitzvahs that we are doing. There's another beautiful explanation, and that is that sometimes we get to parts of the Torah, because we all know that we're supposed to learn Torah, but then we get to certain parts of the Torah. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I know that I have this experience sometimes. You look at it and you say, this is not an area that I can really wrap my head around. It's too complex, right? So either, for example, you might be learning, let's say, a very technical part of Jewish law, or very often where this happens is where a person is trying to learn an abstract spiritual concept, so something that's a little bit more mystical. It's like, this is above my pay grade, it's not for me. I don't get it, I don't understand it. So, Kal Kanesher, there's a beautiful pirush on the Mishnah called the Yachinu Boyaz. So he says that if you look at an eagle, the eagle, what distinguishes the eagle from other birds is the altitude at which it flies. So from our vantage point, it almost looks like the eagle flies into the sun. In other words, the eagle gives this impression of, I'm not afraid to head directly into that intensity. Doesn't matter how strong, how bright, how hot the sun is, I'm happy to go directly into it. And so by the same token, when we come to parts of Torah that we think are too intense for us, or over our heads, or too difficult, or too mystical, so kal kanesha means we should have that enthusiasm to say, I'm going to throw myself right into it. I'm going to go into the difficulty and try and unpack it. Obviously not alone, because we might get nowhere. We're going to find the resources, find the teacher, find the insight, and actually delve into that bright, blinding light of what the Torah has to teach. He also continues, by the way, to say, Rotz Katzvi, all of the interpretations are pretty much the same. That to run like a deer means to run to do mitzvahs. Everybody says that. Except the Yachin adds one layer to it. What does it mean to run to do a mitzvah? Doesn't mean if you have a mitzvah to do, you should go, I don't know, drive over the speed limit. What does it mean that you should run to do a mitzvah? So he says what it means is you shouldn't wait to understand what the mitzvah is all about. You should just go do the mitzvah. That's what it means to run to do a mitzvah. Don't wait, don't hesitate, don't first explore, examine, research. There's a mitzvah to do. You go, you do the mitzvah, and subsequently you'll have the opportunity to learn all about it. Medrash Shmuel says that a deer, when it runs, have you ever, when we say deer, have you ever, no. You know when you take, you'll excuse me, I hope I don't offend anybody, but when you take Americans to the Kruger, right? So what do Americans do at the Kruger? They see deers, right? they see deers. It's all like one broad thing. So we obviously, we're much more expert. We know the difference between a hartebeest and a kudu and a chemsbok and an impala, So I don't know if you've ever seen, but kudus, their horns are designed in such a way that if they throw their head back, the spiral of their horns helps them. It's almost like wearing glasses. It helps them to be able to zoom in and see what's behind them. And that's one of the ways they protect themselves from predators. It's because it focuses their vision so that they can see what threats lie behind them. So the Medrash Shmuel says that the thing about a deer is when it runs away from a predator, it always looks back. It always looks back to see where the threat is. Just to run isn't necessarily the chokhmah, because you don't know, perhaps the one predator's coming from here and another one's coming from there. So it's constantly checking its surroundings to see where the threat is. And so when he says running to do a mitzvah, it's not just simply to run to do a mitzvah. It also means that while we're running forward, we also have to be very conscious of what is threatening us. In other words, what are the things that might distract us? What are the things that might get us involved in inappropriate behavior? So we've got to constantly not just move forward, but be very pragmatic about what we're moving away from as well, which is quite a good insight. And then to be strong as a lion, what does it mean to be strong as a lion? It means to overcome the Yetzer Hara. So that's the link back to the leopard. The leopard is to be bold enough to say, I can do this. And the lion tells us that if there will be impediments, internal impediments, there's going to be a Yetzer Hara. So I'm going to overcome that Yetzer Hara. But how will I overcome that Yetzer Hara? Because I know that Hashem is going to help me. The Gemara tells us, very famous Gemara, that every single day, a person's Yetzer Hara attempts to kill them. So it says, every single day, a person's Yetzer Hara attempts to kill them. If Hashem did not help us to overcome the Yetzer Hara, we would never overcome the Yetzer Hara. So that's the symbol of the lion. We know that lion throughout Tanakh is used as a symbol to represent Hashem. That's why the Beis Hamikdash is in the shape, or at least the Heichal is in the shape of a crouching lion. So to be strong as a lion is to know our strength is not our own. If we believe that our strength is our own, well then, who's to say that we can actually achieve these things? Be bold in the face of scoffers, and to be able to push ourselves to learn things that are beyond us, and to run to do mitzvahs and stay away from distractions. Who says we'll be able to do it? When we recognize that Gibor Ka'ari, that we're strong as a lion, in other words, our strength is not from us, but it is Hashem's assistance, well then we have nothing to be afraid of. And then we have no reason to back down, and then we have no reason not to succeed in what we do. And that's how he rounds it off. La'asos Ratzoin Avicha Shebashamayim. We need these 4 components in order to be able to do the will of our Father in heaven. However, if a person doesn't have that focus of La'asos Ratzoin Avicha, to do what Hashem wants, if that's not what is driving us, then we can go to the extreme, az ponim. Then instead of having healthy chutzpah, then we have unhealthy chutzpah. And we know that unhealthy chutzpah, as it is sometimes called by our sages, chutzpah beloi toga, which is chutzpah that has no basis. If you get involved in unfounded chutzpah, that's a direct line to Gan Eden. We had a teacher when we were in yeshiva in Israel. I've mentioned him here before, Mendel Futterfass. He once said that what does it mean, az ponim legehenim, that a chutzpahdik person goes to Gehenim? What's the connection between a chutzpahdik person and Gehenim? So he said very simply, because when people pass away after 120 years and they think they're big tzaddikim, and they arrive on the other end, who's going to tell them that they've actually got to go to Gehenim? So you need somebody with chutzpah. So as ponim legehenim, you have a chutzpahdik person up there who tells people when they got to go to Gehenim because nobody else would do it. Okay, so what does it mean, as panim legehenim? What does it mean that a person has chutzpah goes to Gehenim? It means the chutzpah that a person has to override what their teachers or more senior people are saying. That's the kind of chutzpah that gets a person into serious trouble. We know we've had, unfortunately, many examples in our history of people who stood up and argued against authority, argued against the Rabbanim, argued against their teachers, and they landed up destroying their lives. We know that. So that's what he means when he says, az ponim legehenim, that a person has chutzpah, not azus, not the strength and confidence that is founded in Torah, la'asos ratzoin avicha shebashamayim, because I want to do what Hashem says, and therefore I'll be strong. Person has chutzpah because they have chutzpah. That's the person who's going to go down the tubes. So this is the distinction between azus and azus ponim, and not the same. We're going to talk briefly about boishas ponim, and then we're going to come back to the balance. How do you achieve the balance? What is boishas ponim? It doesn't say modesty here. It doesn't say humility. The other words that we could use, right? Other words that we could use. Anova, shiflos. These are words that we've actually seen previously in the Mishnayos. What is boishas ponim? It's a beautiful insight. The beautiful insight as follows. What happens when a person is embarrassed? Physiologically, what happens to a person when they're embarrassed? They pale, right? Halbonas panim. That's how we call it in Torah. We call it causing somebody to pale. That's what we call halbonas panim, causing somebody to pale. Gemara in Sota tells us a very famous story about, I'm sure you remember, with Yehuda and Tamar. What does the Gemara tell us? That a person should be willing to cast themselves into a fire rather than malbin pnei chaveiro. So that's why Tamar didn't want to say Yehuda was the one who impregnated her. So she said very simply, do you recognize these things? Whoever they belong to, that's who's responsible. So she didn't want to embarrass him. And from that the Gemara learns, because if he hadn't owned up, she would have been burnt to death. So from that the Gemara learns that rather cast oneself into the fire than embarrass somebody else. What's the link between casting? That story happened to be a story of casting someone into the fire. But what's the link? Because the sensation, the physical sensation of shame is burning. You actually feel like your cheeks, your face is aflame. And that's how we associate with blushing, right? That your face is aflame. So that's the link between embarrassment and fire. Therefore, boishes ponim, if a person has suffered through an experience in their life where they have been shamed in public, that replaces the experience of going into Gehenim, and therefore boishes ponim legan Eden. The person who's had a serious experience of being shamed in their life, that person now has a ticket to Gan Eden because they've already experienced Gehenim in this world. How's that for a thought?
Hey.
That's an incredible thought, right?
If somebody shames you, they release you
from Gehenna, right? How do
it's self-brought, like if you brought it onto yourself?
No, we're talking about being shamed by somebody else. Being shamed by somebody else.
Absolutely nothing to do with you.
Yeah, not correct. Not that somebody did something that was a bad thing, and therefore talking specifically about.
Would that cover if somebody thinks it's funny to mock you?
I'm sure there are many areas that it could include. But the point is that the person is shamed publicly. I don't know if you've heard, but there are a number of stories that did the rounds a number of years ago Because there's another place in the Gemara that speaks about the fact that if somebody has experienced shame, then Hashem will also answer their tefillas. So there's some interesting stories that did the rounds a few years ago about people who had been shamed publicly and then davened, and like miraculous things happened. Anyhow, it's a fascinating topic in its own right. Now the key question is this. I almost feel compelled to say, raise your hand if you feel that you have chutzpah. What I'm trying to illustrate is, chutzpah is not something, generally speaking, that people work to achieve. It's typically either part of your personality or it's not part of your personality, right? I think that's fair to say. There are those people who are very out there and bold and in your face and they couldn't care what anybody thinks. And then there's the rest of us. So how do you get this balance right? Because this Mishnah is telling us that as kanomer, to be bold as a leopard, which means to have the chutzpah to stand up to the whole world and say, Judaism is right, the Torah is true, our values are the absolute truth, and you're all going to get yourself into a lot of trouble if you lay a finger on any of us or on our land, which is all true. Just parenthetically, just to illustrate that point, there was a time, I don't remember exactly when it was, but one of the many, many times where Israel was negotiating territory. And at the time, the Rebbe said, you are doing a disservice to the Arab population because Hashem is truth. Hashem promised the land to the descendants of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. If you now allow other people to claim that territory, you are forcing them to do something against what Hashem wants. That is going to be catastrophic for them. They will suffer. Forget about us worrying about ourselves. They will suffer. It will be catastrophic for them because you're forcing them to go against what Hashem wants. Now you've got to have the boldness to get up and say this. It's not so simple, right? So some people are like that. They don't have an issue and they get up and they say things like it is, and the rest of us find it difficult. The problem with the people who are that bold is they tend often to have a lot of chutzpah in other areas and it's not always so healthy. So those are the people who don't necessarily take their marching orders from other people who might happen to have greater knowledge than they do, etc. So how do you get this balance right? One thing we've seen consistently throughout Pirkei Avos is the person who teaches a particular teaching has something about them that reflects that teaching, and very often that is reflected in turn in their name. So for example, we saw that when we spoke about Rabbi Shimon being a student of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and therefore he had that kind of dedication to Torah learning, one of the examples we looked at. Now the word Yehuda, this is Yehuda ben Tema. So Yehuda is a name that comes from the word Hapa'am Oide Es Hashem. That's what Leah said when Yehuda was born. This time, I will acknowledge Hashem, which is weird, because surely she acknowledged Hashem for all her other children. Surely. So what does it mean? It means another level of acknowledgement. Hoida'a is to acknowledge that somebody else is right, and I'm not necessarily right. In other words, complete acceptance of Hashem's authority. When a person builds their Judaism on their own feelings or their own priorities, then it's always possible that we could some way get it wrong. When we build our Judaism on Yehuda, on an acceptance that I have to live in line with what Hashem wants, and so I do things because Hashem said so, not because they resonate with me, not because they make sense, not because that's what my community does, but because this is what Hashem wants from me, that is the person who knows how to have the paradox of chutzpah when required, and no chutzpah in an inappropriate way. To put it a little differently, when any of us has to stand up for Judaism and we feel like we're standing up for something personal, well then depending on how personally invested we are and what kind of personality we have, that will determine how strongly we're willing to stand up for something. Whereas when we realize, I'm not standing up for me, I'm doing what Hashem wants. So right now Hashem wants me to do this. That allows us to be able to do it with the fullest strength and courage and tenacity that we might not necessarily have of our own accord. Now the Gemara says in two places, both in Sanhedrin and in Sota, except it uses slightly different words, that one of the key signs that you're living in Ikvasa de Mashiach, in the time just before Mashiach, is that there'll be a tremendous amount of chutzpah in the world. So the Gemara in Sota calls it chutzpah yaski, that there'll be an inflation of chutzpah, and the Gemara in Sanhedrin is closer to our Mishnah. It says ho'azus tarbe, that there'll be a lot of chutzpah. It's the same principle. There'll be a lot of chutzpah in the world. And dare we say, the world we're living in today has a tremendous amount of chutzpah. The chutzpah of people to demand that because they feel differently to mainstream society, the whole of mainstream society has to adopt their way of thinking. The chutzpah of people getting up and saying, the chutzpah of what's going on in the world today, where in the face of an absolute massacre in the most horrific, brutal terms, people still have the chutzpah to turn around and give this so-called moral high ground, which is obviously fantasy, that they have good justification to still not criticize. Forget about supporting Israel. Not criticize brutality is a chutzpah that is she'en kamoyu, something we have never seen. So chutzpah is directly associated with the preparations for Moshiach, and in the same way, there's two kinds of chutzpah. There's going to be a really, really toxic chutzpah that's predicted to happen in the world, and equally, there's going to be an expectation of us to have the azus kanomer, to have the strength and the courage and the boldness to stand up to that chutzpah. And to be able to say, similar to how the pasuk says, the haftarah that we read on Chanukah, Yig'ar Hashem b'cho hasatan, that Hashem will deride you, the Satan, who wants to stand up against Yerushalayim. Like there's there's that kind of strength that we need to have. Because of that, because chutzpah is so directly associated with the preparation for Mashiach, that's why this Mishnah has a prayer in it for Mashiach, specifically for the building of the Beis HaMikdash. You find the Rambam doing a similar thing when he goes through the laws of the Parah Aduma. So he tells us all the halachas of how the Parah Aduma works, and then at the end he tells us, in history, there were 9 times that the Jewish people prepared a Parah Aduma. V'ha'asiri, the 10th of the Parah Adumois, that Yaseh Melech HaMoshiach, Moshiach will produce the 10th of the Parah Adumois. Meheira yigale amen kein yehi ratzoin. The Rambam inserts a prayer. He doesn't do it anywhere else in the whole of 14 volumes of the Mishnah Torah. But because he has an opportunity to daven for Mashiach, he inserts it, teaching us a lesson that when we have an opportunity, we should daven for Mashiach. Any opportunity that arises, we should daven for Mashiach. It's exactly what this Mishnah is doing too. So you've just told us about chutzpah. Chutzpah is one of the signs of Mashiach. Yehi ratzoin. Should it, please God, immediately bring us the Beis HaMikdash. And in doing so, we're actually showing not only the link between chutzpah, but also the link to this concept of ratz katzvi, that you should be enthusiastic to do mitzvahs. Well, that's how, we can't just say be enthusiastic. We have to show that enthusiasm. We wish to have the Beis HaMikdash because then we can fulfill mitzvahs that we've been unable to do for thousands of years. So if we're going to put our money where our mouth is, then we're going to say Yehi Ratzoin. As soon as we talk about this topic, about the enthusiasm for mitzvahs, let's show how enthusiastic we are and daven for the Beis HaMikdash to be manifested. Now what happens when the Beis HaMikdash is built? Then Rasein Chelkeinu B'Seirasecha. Then Hashem will give us our portion in His Torah. The simplest answer for why that is because when we're in Golus, we have to spend a lot of our time doing other things besides learning Torah. Got to earn a living, we've got to take our kids to and from who knows what. There are a lot of things we have to do that take up time, which otherwise could have been dedicated to learning Torah. When Mashiach comes, we're told what's going to happen. The Navi Yeshaya tells us, Va'omdu zorim v'ro'u tzoinechem, that other nations will help us to take care of our physical needs. So that, as the Rambam says, Lo yiyeh eisa kol ha'olam kuloi ela ladasas Hashem belvad, the whole focus of the world will be to know Hashem, and your soul will be chachamim gedolim v'yodin dvarim astumim. We'll just sit and learn Torah the whole day. So Yehi Ratzoin. Now we're making this prayer for the Beis HaMikdash. What will happen when the Beis HaMikdash comes? Then we're saying Chelkeinu B'Seirasecha, our portion, meaning to say our time. What will we be involved in? Learning Torah. We will no longer be worried about earning a living and all those things. It will all be done by others. Whether those others are human or whether they are robotic, whether it's going to be the AI revolution, remains to be seen. But the fact is that our needs will be taken care of by others, and therefore there's also one more layer to this. We're told that just in the same way as there are 600,000 letters in a Torah, that's not actual letters, it's all the malay and chaser and things, but there's 600,000 letters in a Torah which are supposed to reflect 600,000 neshamas. Therefore, every person has a part of the Torah that is uniquely linked to their neshama. V'sein chelkeinu b'seirasecha is a prayer for Hashem to please allow us to find our chelek, our unique part in His Torah. Or you could take it one step even deeper than that. V'sein chelkeinu, every one of us has a portion of Torah that by this stage we have learnt. Every one of us. That's our chelek. That's our portion of the Torah. It's the part of the Torah that we have mastered up until this point. However, the way that we have learned the Torah up until this point can only be as far as our intellectual ability allows. But then there's Torah secha. There's the Torah as Hashem knows it, because Hashem is infinite. And therefore the way that Hashem knows the Torah is in an infinite way, which is obviously way beyond anything we could understand. Means if we are bold as a leopard, which means that we push ourselves to do things that are difficult for us to do, and we run with enthusiasm after the mitzvahs, and we delve like that eagle into the blazing sun to learn more than even what comes naturally to us, and we have the strength of the lion to fight and overcome our Yetzer Hara, then we are entitled to ask Hashem, V'sein chelkeinu, let our portion of Torah that we have learned be b'soira secha, with an insight into how you know that part of Torah, so that it's not just simply limited to how we understand it, but allow us the opportunity to see the Torah in its full depth and its full breadth and its full understanding. So, ending off with this Mishnah, obviously we echo the words, Yehi Ratzon, may it be Hashem's will. The Midrash Yalkut Shimoni tells us that the month of Cheshvan was reserved for the festival of the inauguration of the third Beis HaMikdash. So please God, we should see Yehi Ratzon, Sheibone Beis HaMikdash V'mheira V'yameinu. We should see the restoration of the Beis HaMikdash now.